Welcome to our panel, Health Professionals, Perpetrators, Activists, and Healers. My name is Rob Crawford. I'm at the University of Washington in Tacoma, Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. And I'll introduce the panel and the panelists, and then I'll give a short presentation myself. Thank you for coming to always a difficult subject to dwell upon, and so I greatly appreciate your undertaking that effort. Dwight MacDonald, thinking about how the Holocaust occurred with extensive participation from every sector of German society, said that the important news from the Holocaust was not that they could do it to us, but that we could do it. Talking about the issues of complicity and participation that extend through the entire society. Around the same war, Robert J. Lifton, a psychohistorian, asked the question about how could healers, doctors in Germany, become killers? Under what condition? How could that happen? Certainly, torture by the United States government in the years 2001 to 2009 have raised very hard and compelling questions for us around these concerns. How was it that our own government came to commit massive human rights abuses? How is it that immoral and illegal policies that require the complicity of many individuals from a variety of professions and positions within the government and the military, how did that occur? How do individuals who, out of a sense of duty to government, perhaps, or maybe by some kind of ideological commitment themselves, how did they come to comply with those policies and therefore become perpetrators themselves? We know something about the role of lawyers in this torture policies that were created. That's been in the news a lot, but we know a lot less about the role of medical personnel. But now it's been documented, and increasingly documented, how medical staff in the CIA and at the Pentagon played critical roles in development and carrying out of torture, including the design and the recommendation of techniques such as sleep deprivation, stress positions, isolation, waterboarding. Other medical personnel exploited their medical knowledge to identify how combinations of techniques could be used to break the person being interrogated, or how to keep them alive at the edge of life while they were being tortured. Professional knowledge was used to help understand how you disorganize a personality. Of course, there's much more. Our panelists will tell us only parts of the story. A story which includes the fact that to date, no accountability has happened for, and no disciplinary actions have happened to those professionals, whether they be lawyers or medical personnel, who participated in these illegal and immoral acts. The story also includes, however, those inside the government who were medical and personnel, psychologists and others, who took seriously their professional commitment to do no harm. And these individuals did intervene early and raised objections, and their resistance to that torture regime will go down in history. Finally, there's another important story of medical personnel and other professionals who attempt to restore what was undone by torture. These are the healers. The question of responsibility will not go away. We cannot wish it away. And the same questions, of course, have to be applied beyond the perpetrators to the question of the bystanders, the larger public. These questions about responsibility also press upon us. So our intention in this panel is to provide critical information but also to convey the urgency of this still unattended transgression of our collective moral being. An urgency, ultimately, which would require us, I believe, to speak out against blind obedience to the state. So our first speaker today will be Dr. Jess Ghannam. Dr. Ghannam is Clinical Professor of Psychiatry and Global Health Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. He is on faculty in the Center for Global Public Health in the School of Public Health at UC Berkeley. He serves as a consultant with the Center for Constitutional Rights and Reprieve and is working on many of the Guantanamo cases currently under review. He is also working with the University of California, Berkeley Human Rights Center on a project evaluating the post-release health effects of detention in Guantanamo. Our second speaker will be Dr. Randall Horton. Randall Horton is Assistant Professor of Psychology at Seattle University. He is a licensed clinical psychologist whose teaching and research interests lie in the areas of cultural psychology, refugee and immigrant mental health, and the psychology of ethno-political violence. Our third speaker, Dr. David Kenzie. Dr. Kinzie is Professor of Psychiatry at Oregon Health and Sciences University and a Fellow of the American College of Psychiatrists. He received his MD degree from the University of Washington and also took his residency in psychiatry here. He worked as a general physician in Vietnam and Malaysia and has a fellowship in transcultural psychiatry at the University of Hawaii, had that fellowship. He originated the Intercultural Psychiatric Program at OHSU, and he is actively treating patients from Vietnam, Cambodia, Somalia, Bosnia, Ethiopia, and many who have been, others who have been many of whom have been severely tortured. Finally, Rob Crawford, University of Washington, I'll come down anytime. Tacoma, I teach in interdisciplinary arts and sciences, both graduate and undergraduate, and currently I'm teaching courses on torture and ideology, torture and human rights, post 9/11, and the like. So I'm working in our current war on terrorism and responses to it. So we'll start with Jess Ghannam, Dr. Jess Ghannam.
Thank you, Rob. And I want to also thank the organizers for putting on this amazing event at UW. I guess I'm in a bit of a unique position insofar as that not only doing research on the effects of detention at Guantanamo and some of the post-release consequences, and I should say unintended consequences that appear to be most interesting. I've had the rather unique position of both treating victims of torture as well as perpetrators of torture. And it's been very compelling as a clinician to see it from both sides, and perhaps if there's time later on in the discussion section for Q&A, we can talk about it. Confronting ugly and painful things is an essential aspect of any therapeutic process to overcome traumatic experiences. Unless confronted, they remain in the dark, corners of the mind, often festering, and without the light of the spoken word, can grow into and cause irreparable damage, both psychologically and physically. We, I think, as a society and as health professionals, must now confront the same hidden and ugly truths about Guantanamo and torture. On January 22nd, 2009, Barack Obama said in front of the world, the United States will not torture. Here I'm in front of you telling you that on this day, April 24, 2010, the United States continues to torture on a regular basis, not only in Guantanamo, but in other places of the world. Here are some other painful truths that we must confront. The US does torture, it continues to torture, and it tortures in Guantanamo, in Bagram, and in black sites throughout the world. And just for those of you that might not know this, there are black sites in Guantanamo itself and in Bagram. The United States has also been in the torture business since its inception, and since 1950 has developed, institutionalized, and manualized and distributed torture throughout the world, often with destructive and unintended consequences. Third, torture is unequivocally illegal, immoral, unethical, and prohibited by international convention, international law, the Geneva Convention. Fourth, perhaps most important, torture does not work. This has been demonstrated time and time again. In fact, there are very compelling, interesting reports from the Roman Empire of some of the Roman emperors writing about the fact that torture does not work some 1,000 years ago. What we have to confront, I think, nowadays, given the fact that even Barack Obama says the United States torture, and there's rather compelling evidence that we do continue to torture, that the United States has been involved in what I would call a torture industrial complex. Actually, the United States has been at the forefront of developing torture techniques. And if you were to review the 2,000-year history of torture, there hadn't been a lot of change in torture techniques up until 1950s, when the United States, in complicity with the Academy, and I mean this is really, when we talk about the torture industrial complex, the complicity between the US Academy, the academic institutions, and funding from the US government developed this brand new manualized torture techniques that was basically called the no-touch torture techniques. So what the United States contributed to the torture project here is an ability to torture people and not leave a mark. Up until the 1950s, the evidence of torture left very brutal marks throughout the body. And in the 1950s, with the help of people like Hebb, the Milgram experiments that were done at Yale, the Zimbardo experiments that were done at Stanford, they were able to develop and manualize a technique for no touch, no marks left on the body torture techniques. So when I say torture doesn't work, that's a bit of an understatement, because when we're looking at some of the data right now, and I'm sorry that I can't give you all of the results today because we're in the process of analyzing the data right now, it's not that torture does not work, and what that typically refers to when we say torture does not work is that when you torture an individual, they will say whatever you want them to say so that you'll stop torturing. This has been demonstrated hundreds, if not thousands of times. People will say whatever you want them to say so that you'll stop torturing. False confessions, false information. But what I mean to say, and having interviewed a number of Guantanamo detainees who have been released, and looking at some of them who have been released and have attempted to be on their own now for a number of years, the kind of torture does not work, the unintended consequences, is not only do they have profound physical and psychological damage, which we're well documenting, but the long-lasting and what I would call irreparable effects and vulnerabilities that these individuals have are truly terrifying to imagine for all of us. The indelible psychological and physical damage, in my opinion, and surveying both the literature and my own clinical experience, leaves me with this very painful realization that these indelible marks psychologically never leave. We're very fortunate in the data set that we have at Berkeley with my colleagues Eric Stover and Laurel Fletcher. We have perhaps the largest data set of interviewed post-Guantanamo detainees, about 63 individuals. And when we're looking through the data and we look at some of the unintended consequences, and I don't know if many of you know this, but 95% of people in Guantanamo were knowingly innocent. And this has more recently come out if you've paid attention to some of the media reports. Not conservatively, I might add, 95% of the people who ever spent time at Guantanamo were innocent. When we look at those individuals, the individuals who have been released thus far, those individuals, again, not only do they have the physical damage, which includes profound gastrointestinal difficulties, headaches, other physical scars from the touch torture that was done in Guantanamo, but from the non-touch torture, the sensory deprivation, the sleep deprivation, all of the non-touch techniques that the United States was very clever at developing, these individuals have noticed a very profound and decidedly turn for the worse, not only for themselves as individuals, but for their families, their extended families, their communities. Economically, their conditions have worsened. Many of the individuals, if not the majority of these individuals, have noticed the decimation of their families and their extended families. And quite painfully, some of them who have been repatriated to their countries of origin have had to be subjected to ongoing torture from their home countries once they leave Guantanamo. So the trajectory of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, ending up in Guantanamo, being there for 5 to 7 to 8 years, being tortured on a regular basis, and then being released, many of these individuals have never recovered. You know, I want to say a little bit about the torture centers, because not only do we have access to the individuals who have been released from Guantanamo, we're currently also involved in a study looking at the effects of Iraqis who were tortured at Abu Ghraib. Many of you remember the emblematic pictures from Abu Ghraib when US and UK forces were involved in a torture project at this prison that housed some thousands of individuals who were tortured on a regular basis. Our initial interviews of these individuals has found, for example, that their lives again have taken a very decidedly big turn for the worse. They continue to have all the physical complaints and difficulties that I spoke about with the Guantanamo detainees. And by the way, this is a very common thing that we know in the literature: the GI difficulties, the headaches, the difficulty concentrating, the PTSD-like symptoms, the nightmares, which occur over a lifetime, That the Abu Ghraib survivors are finding out that not only were they tortured in Abu Ghraib, that once they left and went back into their communities, especially after US or coalition forces, left the scene, that they were subject to harassment and torture and attack by local militia. So it never stopped. The current reports, the current data that are out there right now on torture, just so that you know, especially 5 minutes, thank you. The current information that is available right now, we have testimonials from detainees, and a good source of information on testimonials from detainees you can get from the UK Guardian newspaper, in case you're interested. Andy Worthington has a blog. He's a UK correspondent. He's written a book called Guantanamo Files, and he's cataloged and done an amazing job of cataloging every single individual, to some extent, that has been and is currently in Guantanamo. I would strongly encourage you to read that. You have the ICRC report, which went into Guantanamo and was able to interview a relatively small number of individuals. The ICRC report, well documented, despite what President Obama has said, that torture continued and continues at Guantanamo. We have the Human Rights Watch report. By the way, the ICRC report was only a handful of individuals that they were allowed to interview. We have the Human Rights Report, which also documented the same things that we're finding in the Berkeley study and the UCSF study. But again, that was only a handful of individuals, about 20. You have Physicians for Human Rights. They did a study that, again, only about 15 to 20 individuals. And then the information that we're analyzing right now basically is from 63 individuals who were detained, and then from the Abu Ghraib study, another maybe 150. So where are we? I only have 5 minutes left, and I was commenting to Rob that I probably have about 10 hours to talk about, and I'm trying to squeeze it into about 15 minutes here. But one of the things that I'm hoping that the three of us or the four of us can discuss afterwards is that one of the things that the Guantanamo detainees have repeatedly told us is that health professionals were part of the torture process at every step of the way. We know from the reports, not just from the former detainees, but we also know well documented the biscuit teams, the behavioral science teams. So basically what we had was health professionals primarily, to some extent some physicians, but mostly psychologists, were involved in developing psychological profiles of the detainees so that they could enhance the torture project. So in other words, if an individual, upon interview, was found to be afraid of spiders, for example. This is a well-documented case from one of the individuals that I had worked with, terrified of spiders. So what would they do as part of this individualized torture project? They would be sure to bring spiders and expose this individual to spiders 24/7, days, weeks, and months at a time, creating such psychological and psychic terror that this individual confessed to things, obviously, that he never did. I think in terms of the healers involved in this and the individuals who are in this spot right now of having been trained as healers but turning out to be torture perpetrators is something that we as a society are having to confront. Many of us have confronted many professional organizations calling on health professionals who have participated in the torture process to be held accountable to ethics panels and licensing boards. And unfortunately, they've received the cover of these licensing boards and these associations, as well as the cover of the US government. One thing that I'll leave you with is that we have started a new organization called Coalition, Health Professionals Against Torture. If you're interested, the website is HPAT coalition.org. And we're calling on organizations, health-related organizations, schools of public health, physicians, psychologists, social workers, anybody in a health-related field to join this coalition to make it unacceptable as a health professional, let alone for any human being, to be involved in the torture process. I'll stop my remarks there, and hopefully we'll have some discussion later. Thank you.
Randy Horton.
Let's check the volume here. Is that good? Can you hear me? In the back? Okay. So the subject of my remark is going to extend a little bit on what Dr. Ghannam was talking about, and I'm going to talk specifically about American psychologists' involvement in complicity in torture, this particular profession, and the different roles that psychologists have been active in over the last 10 years or so, since especially 9/11. I'm going to talk in just two parts here. I'm going to talk a little bit about psychologists' involvement in development and implementation of torture and illegal abuses, and I'm going to turn to, in the second part of my talk, an account of the kinds of actions and efforts on the part of individuals both inside and outside of the professional psychological associations and organizations to curtail this type of activity and to enforce accountability for individuals who are involved in different roles in these processes. So, one thing to state from the outset is that information on what has happened in the role of psychologists in these different settings is still trickling out. As recently as last week, we had the release of new documents from the Bush administration's Office of Legal Counsel, which were made public for the first time, which detailed the role of two particular psychologists, or one psychologist and one psychiatrist, in the authorization or the kind of legitimization of some of these non-touch torture techniques and full-on, kind of touch torture techniques as well. We had a report from the Senate Armed Services Committee last year that likewise continues to shed more light. So this is a story that's still kind of being pieced together, and pulling together the information is a real challenge. So in terms of kind of trying to provide a very brief capsule history of psychologists' involvement in in torture since roughly 9/11. We have to talk about the STARR program, which many of you are probably familiar with, or may at least have heard about, which STARR stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. And this was a program that the US military developed in consultation with psychologists towards the end of the Korean War. And there were STARR programs that were established in all of the branches of the US military. And the basic idea of it was that you would kind of take soldiers who might fall into enemy hands, be captured with potentially valuable information, and you would inoculate them against the types of torture or abuse that might be used against them. And the types of treatment that soldiers would undergo during this STARR program consisted of techniques that Jess has already talked about in terms of like these no-touch torture types of techniques, subjecting to sleep deprivation, bombardment with sound and light, stress positions, sexual humiliation, exposure to extremes of heat and cold, and in addition to that, for some people who go through the program, waterboarding. Now, psychologists were in active roles in most of the branches of the service overseeing these STARR programs. They were on site for it. They would kind of work with the people who would be meting out the abuse and kind of checking in both on the recruits who were going through the process and on the people who were dealing out the abuse to make sure that it didn't kind of get out of hand or get out of control. With 9/11 and the new kind of perceived threat against US interests, psychologists, and one psychologist in particular, James Mitchell, but others as well, suggested in kind of collaboration with the CIA, a process of reverse engineering these types of techniques that, that they were already using in these STARR programs, and developing interrogation procedures that would be used on detainees based on these techniques. And the techniques really kind of got their field tests in the new global war on terror in early 2002, and Abu Zubaydah, an Al-Qaeda member, was apprehended in Afghanistan in April of 2002, and after he was in detention of US forces, there are a number of different reports that have kind of come out about how things proceeded. There was an FBI interrogation team that was on site fairly quickly after he was detained, and the reports suggest that the FBI team used more traditional methods of interrogation, which would be based on rapport building and kind of trying to gain trust and confidence of the person whom you're interrogating. And at that time, Zubaydah is said to have revealed important information, for instance, about the role of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in the planning of 9/11. Well, the story kind of moves from there to back to Washington, where a CIA director tenant learned of the detention of Abu Zubaydah and dispatched a CIA-based interrogation team to Thailand, where he was being held. And this team, in tow with this team, was Mitchell, the psychologist, who was one of the individuals who had kind of suggested this reverse engineering of these torture and abuse techniques. And as a part of the interrogation plan that they then kind of enacted with Zubaydah, it involved waterboarding him numerous times, subjecting him to stress, humiliation, sleep deprivation, kind of the full regimen. And the reports from within different individuals involved in that procedure who've come forward and offered testimony is that Zubaydah basically ceased to give useful information after he began to be subjected to these coercive techniques and this torture. Now, for instance, in terms of like kind of how far this goes, leaders of the CIA interrogation team reportedly wanted to build a coffin and bury Zubaydah alive as part of their interrogation plan. One kind of sees the kind of marks of the Mitchell and Jessen kind of approach to psychological strategies of interrogation in that recommendation was not actually acted upon. Someone up the chain of command decided against it. But recent disclosures that have come out within the last year suggest that among the other things, we had videotaping that was going on of the torture and interrogation of Zubaydah and perhaps other individuals. The records now state that CIA states that those tapes were destroyed, but there's indications that there was a second set of kind of data collected, perhaps tapes It's not quite sure what form that data took, but that basically the whole kind of detailed interrogation process of Zubaydah was being used as a form of kind of torture experiment and a study that was supervised by, at this point, it's been disclosed by CIA consultants were apparently analyzing the tapes and the data to arrive at what they would think of as like effective interrogation techniques or ways to use these kind of like blends of these torture techniques most effectively to break individuals. Now, the techniques that were developed there, they were actually kind of word of mouth spread that it was kind of celebrated as a tremendous success. Zubaydah had given up vital information for U.S. security interests. And throughout the branches of the military service, there was increased interest in coercive interrogation. At this point, two other mental health professionals with SEER backgrounds kind of entered the picture. There was Paul Burney, a psychiatrist, and John Laso, a psychologist, who attended important meetings with some Department of Defense staff at Fort Bragg and individuals from the Guantanamo leadership and interrogation groups. And the Guantanamo individuals asked for instruction basically in more coercive interrogation techniques. Burney and Lasso complied with this request, it's now known, and in the aftermath of this, the techniques were brought to Guantanamo and then diffused outward to other sites across the Middle East and other places. Well, in the aftermath of those conversations with the Guantanamo interrogation teams, Bush administration lawyers, it's now known, asked basically these two people, Burney and Lasso, to draft kind of standard guidelines for interrogation policies. And Lasso and Burney penned a memo in a single night based on their experiences with SEER interrogation and their understanding to this point of what these interrogations had produced. They drafted a memo that laid out three categories of coercive force or abuse that would become standard practice eventually within the U.S. military circles. And in the text of the memo that they drafted, though, they warned that very explicitly that these techniques might backfire and that they would produce false information, that they might have very bad repercussions for American policy if it became known that that we were engaging in these techniques. Well, they passed that draft memo upwards through the chain of command, and lo and behold, the kind of codicil and all the reservations that they attached to it became detached somewhere in the process. And several months later, it became DoD policy, and Donald Rumsfeld signed off on an authorization for some of these Category 1, 2, and certain Category 3 tactics as becoming kind of standard acceptable interrogation policy. Now, at this point, a little bit later, we've learned Mitchell and Jessen kind of re-enter the picture in a different capacity. These were two individuals who had originally been part of the SEER interrogation kind of process. And at this point, the Office of Legal Counsel in the Bush administration, and Che Baby in particular, approached these two psychologists to offer an opinion in support of the kind of legal use of these practices. And these two psychologists offered apparently kind of expert scientific testimony that these practices did not result in, and here I'm going to quote from the recent documents, they did not qualify legally as torture because the tactics didn't create severe pain and suffering or lasting medical and mental harm. Certainly conclusions which they had no evidence for and were based on nothing other than their use of these techniques in these SEER schools under very different circumstances, applied very differently if we give them even the most kind of generous benefit of the doubt. Well, the techniques kind of moved outward, and we kind of saw where they ended up. Abu Ghraib, the images from Abu Ghraib kind of hit the American press. And by 2005, there was a backlash and an understanding, beginning understanding that individuals in the field of psychology had been involved in developing and carrying out these techniques and torture. So there was a movement towards accountability, and this is the second part of what I wanted to speak to. The APA president at the time in 2005 convened a task force, the Task Force on Psychological Ethics and National Security, and they returned a kind of study that suggested that psychologists had an active and valuable role to play in the interrogation process. And they reference basically like the current Bush administration legal doctrines and definitions as the standards that should be applied in judging the ethics of particular interrogation techniques. Well, this didn't sit very well with a number of different psychologists, including one of the psychologists who was part of this task force. The task force was heavily loaded with individuals from military interrogation backgrounds. 4 of the 10 individuals on the task force were actually within the chain of command of the military and military services that carried out some of the abuses. So members of the APA who were opposed to this tried to get redress within the APA's kind of like leadership structure. They didn't obtain it there. So they then moved towards, they found a clause in the bylaws that allowed creation of a referendum that would go out to the mass membership of the American Psychological Association. And they succeeded in getting the referendum kind of out there on the ballot to the members. And the members of the APA passed it with a 60% approval in the vote. And that resolution and that referendum states that psychologists cannot work at sites that are in violation of international law or where human rights abuses are likely to be taking place. Sounds all well and good. The problem is that according to the individuals who are most active in this campaign, nothing has changed and nothing has actually been taken in terms of action on the referendum. To try and force the APA to actually, kind of enforce these standards, leaders took the leaders of the movement to kind of gain accountability and end these practices, approached the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and that individual drafted a letter in his official capacity stating that, directed to the APA leadership, that sites like Guantanamo do exist and, in violation of these standards. They're illegal sites where human rights abuses are known to, be likely to continue to be occurring. They sent that letter to the APA. Still, the APA hasn't acted on it. Kind of simultaneous to this, there are a number of other different avenues that activists and concerned individuals, psychologists, have pursued. A lot of these have concerned approaches to the APA ethical boards, but also to state professional boards. And Trudy Bond has been a psychologist who's been very active in this. She's written about this in Counterpunch and a number of other magazines documenting her efforts to get some of the individuals who I've already named, where they have professional licenses in particular states, to get ethical boards in those states to address the charges, to disbar them or take disciplinary action against them. And the long and short is that it hasn't worked to this point. Louisiana rejected the suit that she raised or the ethics complaint that she raised against one prominent individual. And then in response to that, though, Trudy Bond has actually she's filed suit against the state ethics board to force them to act on the basis of their charter and their mandate. Just to wrap up, there have been some other efforts that have been made that have been successful in different ways. My understanding is that in California, the legislature has actually passed a piece of legislation that requires healthcare professionals working in California who are going to be licensed. It forbids them to work with similar language to the APA resolution in sites where torture or human rights abuses might be taking place. Anybody who has more information on this can provide that, I think, in the question and answer period. I couldn't find the actual reference to that. But there are any number of different individuals who are involved in this effort and ways to support this effort. We have journalists and lawyers who've been doing key work in disclosing these kinds of things, in preparing legal documents and briefs, human rights workers, forensic psychologists. We have men and women in the armed forces and intelligence community who have brought forward information, sometimes at personal risk to their careers, about what's been going on and tried to take a stand against that. I want to kind of end with just a note that there is a kind of encouraging picture here of the different roles and the different ways that we can kind of try to work and try and raise awareness and kind of try to combat this and turn a corner on the things that have happened. But there's a tremendous amount of work, unfortunately, that still needs doing. Thanks.
Next, we'll hear from Dr. David Kenzie.
Well, it's nice to be back to a campus where I spent 7 years of my life, and I get post-traumatic stress just coming back, thinking about the exams I took here. The issue that I'm dealing with is refugees and victims of trauma, wars, ethnic cleansing, and violence, as well as torture through around the world. Our clinic in Portland has 1,200 patients currently, 20 different languages, almost all victims of war. Torture occurs in these settings because of the broader definition that coercion, punishment, injury, under color of law, that means someone in a legal capacity or governmental capacity or acquiescence by the government is doing it. This means that there are a lot of torture, not the ones you think about as torture is put in one room and beat up, but a lot of things that happen indirectly as a result of war. And those are the people we take care of. And I'm going to put a face on this by telling you two cases that I've seen. I actually have 270, I just counted them up, patients from around the world that I personally have taken care of, but our clinic has 1,250 children. Abraham, Bosnian man, 60, came in because his wife made him come in. He has nerves, he can't sleep. He was okay until Serbia invaded Bosnia in the war. Since that time, his memory is bad. He wakes up, he screams at night. He can't even go to the bathroom by himself for fear. He's sad and depressed, no will, and has marked reactivation of traumatic memories, both in dreams and the daytime. We asked him about his experience. He said, it's a long story, I don't want to go into it, but he did. His job, as he was in the Serbian concentration camp, was to bury bodies. And he had to go into homes with the stench of dead bodies under guard of the Serbian soldier and bury them. He said there was no washing, and the stench stayed with him for the whole time he was in the concentration camp. He said he was assaulted with a weapon, exposed to a war zone, held in captivity, lack of food and shelter, forced separation, and murder of family and friends, and only later did we find out 40 members of his family had been killed. So he had severe ongoing post-traumatic stress and depression, and I've seen him now, look at that, 5 years. The second one is one I've seen recently from Ethiopia, and I actually just picked these kind of at random. Amharic speaking Ethiopian woman. She says she's married, and that's unclear. 4 or 5 years, poor memory, poor sleep, appetite, no joy, loss of appetite, no joy, tired, and can't think of anything. What comes back to her is when she was imprisoned and tortured. A change in regime in Ethiopia brought her husband to jail, and from people who saw him in jail, they know he was tortured and said released, but in fact, there's been no information from him about him for 9 years. She still says she's married to him and has this fantasy that they'll get together. She then was taken while he was in prison and tied, and she showed me the marks in her arms, which are still there, tied behind her, beaten, and she had soap in her mouth at times so she couldn't breathe. She was finally released, and when she came home, the security forces took her sister's son, 14-year-old nephew, and the next day dropped his dead body on their door. This is what we see. I get about a new case every week. And I'll tell you a few things and then about our reactions. First of all, not everybody does get a severe psychiatric illness, which is kind of amazing. Everybody gets affected, and life is never the same for sure. Those who do get psychiatric illnesses, post-traumatic stress, depression, and increasingly we're seeing psychosis, they are persistent, long-term disabilities. And they can get better, and then they exacerbate with reminders or triggers which bring it back. And so you have this kind of up and down course over many, many years. They also have depression because of all the loss. Refugees have lost home, family, country, language, and so they have losses. and having to adjust. This is not a simple matter of an American attack home, getting assault, and having PTSD. This is something with this total disruption of their lives. And treatment is very, very difficult and profoundly long. The people have also marked social problems, learning language, getting income, learning new jobs, and in most societies, the older you are, the accumulated wisdom has some value. When you come here, the younger generation sees the older generation as having no value. And so we're seeing marked generational disparities. I want to mention a few things for treatment for a health care audience. And then I'll tell a little bit about our own reaction. First of all, treatment is long, slow, persistent, and cautious. There are no tricks. There are no gimmicks. There are no eyes you can move or anything you can do to repress memories. You cannot lie to them. You cannot say, I'll bring back your husband, or imply that, I'll bring back your family, your country. It's gone. That you cannot fix it. So you have to be clear about the goals of treatment. The second thing is you have to be absolutely safe. And that means no abruptness in the therapy, no change in your approach, no kind of razzle-dazzle, and that you are straight and predictable. You don't get too excited when they get well, and you don't get too depressed when they get sick again, because they will. And so you ride with the ups and downs over time. Third thing is continuity. You're with them through it all. And I have patients now for 25 years, and I've stayed with them, they stayed with me, and some go, some come back. But be constant, and continuity is a very important factor. I should mention also, language is very important. All of our counselors who serve as interpreters are also case managers, and about half of them have master's degrees in the United States. So we can accommodate 20 different languages from our counselors. So they serve as interpreters with our psychiatrists and as case managers in between times, and group therapists at times. Symptom reduction. You can, in fact, reduce a lot of symptoms with medication. We have very, very good medicine now, and we know what we can do with a lot of medicine. We can stop nightmares. No one believes me this, but we can't stop it in a short time. We can come back under exacerbation or stress, but we can do that. We can help the depression. It will come back too. And we can take away the biggest problem that people have in families is aggression, anger, and irritability. We can help the sleep disorders. So there are some of those things we can help in this context of a relationship over time. I'm supposed to talk a little bit about the effect on us who give this, and people hear about these terrible stories and, how do you do it and how can you keep going? I've done it for 33 years. It is hard to take. Every time I hear a story, I think that's the worst we could do to each other, and it's not. You find something else. And I guess I got a little bit inured to it from Cambodia, Pol Pot survivors. But you have to take a history, and you have to go over the trauma for two reasons. One is to show that you understand, and two, show that you can take it, that you can listen to it, and not overreact with kind of condescending or over-professional withdrawal. And you have to be able to do that. You only have to do it once, and they can tell you more later if they want to. But that's an important part of what we do, and that's a painful part of what we do. The other thing I should say about this is the joy of seeing people get better. That's what keeps us going. And they do get better. They get worse, but they get better. But they get better with our relationship, I think, as much as anything. So the reactions on us are universal. I did a survey of all our psychiatrists and our counselors. Psychiatrists are a little bit more open than the counselors because many of them went through the same thing. Actually, many of them have the same, get reactivation from taking the histories with us. Irritability happens to almost all of us. You get vicarious traumatization hearing this, and you find yourself getting irritable, upset. An aversion to violence. I simply cannot watch American television or movies. I haven't seen a movie for 15 years. And every one I see has some violence, but even funny ones are violent put down on people. And that went with all of us. Once you've seen how bad people can be to each other, it's hard to keep going and seeing these angry things. I turned on the TV the other night, and in 5 minutes I saw 5 homicides. What the hell is this? I mean, this is terrible. The problem of evil comes up. Why does this happen to them? Why did it happen? And the existential questions that arise about the evil in us as humans. I mean, in my more cynical moments, I think we shouldn't be the people who inherit the earth. Maybe some other species might deserve it better than us, because we really do a lot of damage. That is one of these very, very good questions for which there is no answer. We do not know why we have this evil with capacity within us. And it's hard to answer, but it has to be asked. Like someone said about the Holocaust, some answer is called for, but we don't know what it is. The irritability, the thing that keeps us going is our relationship with each other. And you have to have this or you get burned out. I think, 3 psychiatrists have been with us 20 years, 25 years. About 4 counselors have been with us 30 years. So you have to have a esprit de corps and a feeling that you're doing good. And I do lots of things professionally, but this is the one thing that seems worthwhile. It seems like when you can help restore people's lives, it seems extremely valuable and meaningful. And one thing I should say for health professionals, it is a doctor's job to take care of the dirty, the nasty, the ugly, the disfigurement that cancer can cause, or birth defects and burdens can cause, trauma, injuries can cause. And what we have here is the defects in the human spirit and in the human mind and the human psychic from damage we do to each other. And as painful and ugly as it is, our job is to heal it as best we can and help promote a better life for people. Okay.
Existential questions come about war as well. And as Chris Hedges has argued, cultural questions. How is it that U.S. Culture has come to support and sustain war and think of it as an option available to realize policy goals? Serious cultural and ideological questions. Well, torture, of course, is not always, but often in the context of war. And so to ask cultural and ideological questions of war is important thinking about torture. For example, the idea that war is a practice in which any means available are to be employed in order to win that war. That the idea that the myth of effectiveness of our weapons, of our tactics, of the use of force itself, how that contributes to an ideology in which we believe that torture can produce truth. The idea, again, these ideas are deeply rooted in our ways of thinking about war, and torture is war's companion. So just as a beginning argument, I would say the best way to end torture is to end war. and to end occupations, to reject what I would call the counterinsurgency state. But of course, war continues. And so we invent ways the best we can to deal with war and the human rights abuses that occur in war. And the best means available today for us is we try to humanize war through regulating it, creating a regime of international law, identifying what is a war crime, and trying to enforce these legal rules against the violations of human rights. So we have our Geneva Conventions. We have our UN Convention Against Torture, which says, by the way, that no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war, internal political instability, or any other public emergency may be invoked as a justification for torture. The Convention Against Torture also requires state parties, by the way, which includes the United States, to criminalize torture, to investigate torture, and when found guilty, and when there's sufficient evidence to prosecute torture. In January 2009, as Jess mentioned, President Obama issued an executive order that formally ended torture by U.S. security agencies and the military. Serious questions remain about the continuation of practices. I'm not going to emphasize that today. My point is that I would like to talk about is that there is a continuing struggle in the United States today about torture, and that's an ideological struggle. And what has made that struggle even more paradoxically, even after Obama issued that executive order, paradoxically more seriously a danger for us in terms of becoming a torture culture, is that over the year, ever since Obama was elected and throughout 2009 and into 2010, there has been an outright justification of torture by its defenders and its advocates. And of course, when I say outright justification of torture, they don't use the word torture, they use everything but the word torture. But we know what they're talking about. In fact, they come very, very close to saying that it's torture without using the word. I think that there's been a sea change of this rhetoric of promotion and justification of torture, and I've tried to document it in my own research. It has mostly been a media blitzkrieg, if you will, by top Republican leaders, including former Vice President Cheney, and right-wing ideologues, and also from highly placed national security officials connected to the CIA and other agencies. Through opinion editorials, television and radio appearances, interviews, addresses covered by the media, and sourcing news stories in media, there have been a number of themes that have been promoted. I'm just going to mention a few of them. First of all, they've claimed that when their enhanced interrogation, as they call it, was used in the years of the Bush-Cheney administration, that they were successful in keeping America safe, number one. Secondly, they claimed that the close oversight of the CIA or the threat of investigation of wrongdoing will create a CIA that will become risk-averse. That's the language that they use, with the direct implication that the CIA and the security agencies will back off from doing the, and I quote Cheney here, the mean, nasty, dirty business of keeping America safe from terrorism. They went on to claim that even the limited investigations that are promised into illegal activities, always portrayed, by the way, as a kind of partisan retribution, has already compromised the CIA. This is part of a larger ideological debate about giving the CIA free rein from oversight, from regulation, from law itself, And this has been going on for a long time. I mean, I'll date its modern incarnation from the Church Committee in the 1970s, when new constraints were put on the CIA and the security agencies. And ever since, there's been a war about how much freedom the CIA is going to have from oversight by legal and political institutions. In fact, the CIA, and again, this can be documented, claimed that the reason that 9/11 happened, that is the reason why the CIA was unable to prevent 9/11, is that there were too many constraints on the CIA that had followed from the Church Committee. Crawford Black, a well-known national security spokesperson, said there was a before 9/11 and a not after 9/11, and he infamously said, after 9/11, the gloves came off. Well, the claim now in this ideological barrage of 2009, 2010 is that Obama is putting the gloves back on. This is the claim, and that therefore the implication is pretty direct. Obama is putting the country at risk for doing so. The implication is, of course, again, that if there is another terrorist attack on the United States, it will be Obama and the Democrats who will be responsible for that. My argument is that this sustained and intense campaign to justify torture and to also attack the so-called radical left and Obama's naivete will have profound effects ideologically on our culture. First, and most importantly, I believe that it's already changing public attitudes towards torture. Although in 2001 to 2008, there was significant support for torture, that support increased in 2009. And I'll give you one example. The Pew Research Center poll that was released in December 2009 said that 54% of respondents agreed with the following phrases: that the use of torture to gain information from suspected terrorists can be often justified or sometimes justified. And this was the first time in 5 years of this particular survey asking the same questions that that combination of views had reached a majority of the population. By the way, only 25% of the respondents said that torture could never be justified. Only 25%. Secondly, I believe that these profound effects follow from the fact that Obama and his political advisor, Rahm Emanuel, are political animals. They read the polls, they assess the strength and the power of the right wing, and perhaps they are concerned about what even the security agencies will do, that is, whether they will cooperate with the government or not. The result of that political assessment is that Obama and the Democrats in general have backed off from doing what needs to be done in order to ensure that torture be ended, believing perhaps that their executive order is enough, and maybe even, again, permitting that executive order without thorough oversight to allow the continuation of torture in specific places around the world. So a number of ways that this has happened. Obama moved very quickly to reassure the CIA, using the same language as his critics, that they will not have to become risk averse. They will not have to look over their shoulder at too much about the law. He went to the CIA, he made those reassurances, it was very clear. He also assured the Republicans, as well as the CIA, that there will be no criminal investigations of policy decisions. None, zero. The only thing that would be recommended, as the Attorney General initiated in the summer, would be an extremely limited investigations of those who exceeded the policy that was determined. I'm talking about illegal, clearly illegal policy that exceeded those policies, which were formulated by the now infamous Office of Legal Counsel. The third thing that Obama did, which has made the situation worse, is that he pronounced that as a country, what we need to do after the torture regime of Bush and Cheney is to look forward, not look backward. What this translates into, in my mind, is an advocacy of amnesia, and it's an advocacy which translates that Obama has even prohibited, and said that even a commission of inquiry is off the books. We, as a political society, as a culture, will not look at government complicity with torture. So the consequences are serious. I think the first major consequence is that Obama and the Democrats have ceded the initiative to the right wing on this issue. The Democrats went silent and did not forcefully respond to the ideological advocacy or defense of torture. The moral courage, perhaps, that was initially shown disappeared, and so the message to Americans is that they should not confront its own government's violation of core principles of human dignity. Thus, those who were mildly or strongly supportive of torture were bolstered. Many who were ambivalent, swayed by one-sided rhetoric of torture, and those opposed found that they had no support from their leaders. The torture issue appeared to them to be closed. Let's move on to other more pressing issues. The second major consequence has to do with the rule of law. I believe that the decision by the Obama administration not to investigate and prosecute illegalities is a body blow to the rule of law in this country. General Taguba, in the summer of 2008, and General Taguba was the man who headed up the Abu Ghraib investigations, said that there is no doubt in my mind that war crimes have been committed. This is a general, a U.S. general said this. There is no doubt in my mind that war crimes have been committed. The only question I have is whether anyone will be held accountable for them. The disregard of law in the name of national security or for political convenience has enormous implications for our democracy. In conclusion, I do believe that there is an ideological struggle over torture today, right now. It's greatly amplified, more so in 2009 and 2010. That overt justifications for torture have not been engaged, they have not been responded to by our political leaders, and other opinion leaders have also been more or less silent on this issue. This country's rejection of torture is far from resolved. So if we are to prevent our becoming a torture culture, that is a culture which is willing to accept that torture is a valid instrument of gaining information from so-called terrorists or real terrorists or accused terrorists, that we must respond to the right. If we are to prevent this, we must respond to the right with a no, never, no exceptional circumstances whatsoever. So what is to be done? Well, you've heard it before. Number one, get active. And in the process, let me just say, there are three principles we should keep in mind that should guide I believe, should guide our actions. The first, and let's not go over this lightly, torture is immoral. It's hideous and outrage against human dignity. Like slavery or genocide, it must be opposed with fierce moral condemnation. If torture is normalized, it will tear to shreds the moral fabric of our society. The security hawks tell us that morality is irrelevant to national security, or at best a dangerous distraction. But I would ask, how would a torture culture transform us in America? What would be the consequences for our ideals of common humanity and human dignity, or the sacredness of the individual? for a willingness to inflict suffering in the holy name of safety or national security interests, or for avowed, unavowed motives of revenge. What would it actually mean for us to normalize torture? What will we tell our children? Participation in any way in torture goes against our religious, our secular, our professional ethics, including our medical ethics, and we need to find ways to hold those who violate those ethics accountable. So we must speak to the immorality of torture in our places of worship, our high schools and our universities and our communities. Secondly, the second principle is that torture is illegal. If the rule of law means anything at all, we must hold accountable those who willfully violate it, no matter how high and powerful they are. No one is above the law. The foundations of our democracy, I believe, are at stake, and I would argue that there are powerful national security agencies operating in secret, unaccountable to government, unaccountable to law, that already and do and will continue to pose a danger to our democracy unless they are held to account. Third and finally, torture destroys the credibility of the United States in the world. And that has enormous implications. Because if it is true that torture travels the same road as war and militarism, and that our credibility as a human rights leader in the world, as a country that helps to the development of the world, to alleviate the suffering of the world, then those military solutions will become the preferred solutions. And the tolerance and support for torture would be the same. It would increase along with that. So duty, loyalty, patriotism, whatever you want to call it, requires us, I believe, to defend the ideals of the nation. As James Madison, a long time ago, put it, it is a democracy if you can keep it. Thank you. So we have about 20 minutes at least for conversation, and if people would come up to the microphones, please do.
Thank you. Thanks for the wonderful panel. I wanted to raise one issue that didn't hear addressed as one of the roots of American torture practice, which is the practice that's gone on for decades in the U.S. criminal justice system and in the prison industrial complex of routine actions against inmates. And I'll just highlight a few of those. Number one, the practice of the death penalty, which basically sets the date and time of someone's execution. And I wonder if in the final moments when someone's waiting to sort of set the time and date of their death, if that sort of constitutes torture. Like if I were to tell you, you will be killed on Tuesday at 6 p.m. and at 5 p.m., what are you feeling? Is that a tortured state of mind? Number two, I think that there are supermax facilities that routinely incarcerate people for 23 hours a day continuously, maybe longer for months at a time. Solitary confinement, in which is definitely a psychologically deprived state, no access to other social contact. And there's some anthropologists here at the university who studied that and talked about the degradation of the mental state. People start throwing their feces against the wall. I guess that's similar to what gorillas do when they're also enclosed, and this is enclosed in a confined space for hours. And I wonder if that's sort of a part of our torture history, is that we do this routinely in our prisons. And then finally, I worked with a medical marijuana patient who traveled from the United States to Canada to seek asylum because he had 13 back surgeries and chronic pain, and he was told by his captors, if he were to be caught in California, they would take him in prison and not allow him to use his pain medicines. It's something he's been using for years because of his injuries, severe injuries. And so he was actually forced to flee the country, and then when they captured him, they actually brought him back to the United States from a hospital with a urinary catheter still in place. And I saw him in the federal court here in Seattle, basically in agony, and we were able to go to court and have him released to to Harborview Hospital so they could treat his prostatitis and things were going on, and resume his pain treatment. Withdrawal from pain treatment, lack of access to basic medical facilities in US prisons as routine. So I see some of these things as kind of the roots of our torture culture. So I just wanted to see if there's any comments.
Well, had I been given 40 more minutes to talk, I would have gotten there, because that was in some of my prepared remarks, because absolutely, I mean, you don't have to look very far at, especially being from California, where there is a huge lawsuit in California against the prison industrial system within California for those very same things. And you don't have to look very far around the edges of the prison experience in the United States to see elements of torture, to see elements of all of the characteristics that can be defined as torture: and enhanced interrogation, the sensory deprivation. And if you talk to people who have been in the Supermax facilities, it's not random that when Obama talked about closing Guantanamo, they talked about bringing the detainees to Supermax facilities in the United States. That's not random. So I think that in terms of the discussion here having to do with torture that's being done somewhere else, we absolutely have to take that next step of looking at what we're doing in our own prison industrial complex. Absolutely, I couldn't agree with that more.
Thank you, moderator and distinguished speakers. I found your presentation very insightful and reflective and challenging. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that the credibility of US you are talking about. You know, I'm part of a team in India that has been working for the compliance of our country to the CAT, the Convention Against Torture. For the first time, 2 weeks ago, the Indian cabinet has approved India's compliance with it. And we have a lot of things to learn and work to make our culture, torture, I'm scared to say the word free, but at least less. Now, I also am returning from Sri Lanka, where when the US said, there are war crimes, let us have a UN inquiry, that tiny little country was able to say, how can you say that when you have Abu Ghraib? Is there a UN commission on that? In other words, the credibility, moral credibility seems to be suffering for US, which is looked upon by many countries as models in many other very wonderful things, higher education, for example. So it is wonderful that there is this discussion, and I hope from this audience there will be a president, an attorney general, a chief of army, and a CIA director. But in the meantime, how do we do from this audience? Who will resist these kinds of things and have a humane approach? However, in the meantime, this is my question. The question is, I feel that as a nation or as nations, we seem to suffer from some sort of paranoia out of which these excessive reactions come to torture others as if that will guarantee our safety. See, how do we treat that? Connected with that is, I am shocked to see all over the world, as it seems to have happened here, a sense of groupthink of such intelligent people who comply with these kinds of things, and after all the damage is done, do post-mortem. And finally, a connected question is, with so much experience that you have, what would you recommend those who work with torture survivors and victims as effective steps towards preventing their own burnout or being traumatized themselves. I see this often. I saw this in tsunami. I saw this in other places. People go and work for a week and come running away, never to go back again. This must be taking a toll on the healers. I'll be grateful for any comments.
One about your first comment. Some of the justification in Ethiopia for detention was that America did it at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, so it justifies that if America can do it, we can do it, and it speaks to the issue of moral authority. The issue of burnout is a good one. It takes a couple things. It takes competence. First, a lot of people doing this have good-hearted but don't have clinical skills. Let's be frank about it. A lot of people rush in, their mental health teams rushing into disaster areas, and there's 3 studies now that shown that can fixate the PTSD, not alleviate it. It's not a time to ask about how you feel about having your babies killed. It's a time to do something else. The other thing is it needs a group to work together to support each other and to deflect and to cathartic all the problems that you have with this. And the last thing you need is long-term engagement, so you see people getting better. And the joy of having people get well keeps us going.
I just want to say that the thing that I come back to over and again is that it's the culture of impunity that I'm very concerned about in this country. That and many of us have alluded to it. The first step in the process as a society as well as individuals of coming clean is to be held accountable, and to not have impunity in the face of morality, legality, and ethics. And when we take on a task as health professionals, we have legality, ethics, and morality that we are bound by. And yet, when we claim to be this great moral leader in the world, and we claim to be the great purveyor of democracy throughout the world, and we have the specter of Abu Ghraib, and we have the specter of supporting some really wretched regimes all over the world, and we have Guantanamo, that people laugh at this country, they laugh at us. And so if there continues to be impunity without accountability, we're not going to get anywhere. That has to be the first step.
Yeah, hi. I think the question I'm curious about is, what does everyone make of the American Psychological Association, and what's going on? I mean, ethnomusicologists have come out very strongly against the use of music to torture people, and they're not anti-hip-hop or rap as far as I know. I mean, the American Psychiatric Association, the nurses, there's human rights. I mean, okay. Any idea what might help? I mean, what happened or didn't happen?
I could try to speak to this one a little bit. I don't have an entire kind of clear picture of this, but there's a kind of popular misconception of the field of psychology that we're touchy-feely, do no harm, kind of uplift humanity. And if you actually do kind of a close historical reading of the field and the profession, kind of like where it earns its stripes, how it originally distinguished itself as a unique field, different from, for instance, like different from the field of psychiatry. In its earliest days, the field of psychology was deeply involved in the mental testing movement and the promotion of eugenics policies. Psychologists performed some of the work, some of the studies that were taken up by the Nazi Party in Germany and became a kind of centerpiece of the justification of euthanasia campaigns and killing of the mentally ill. Again and again and again, the APA was dragged kind of kicking and screaming to the fight for civil rights. There was a deeply entrenched kind of group of psychologists in the leadership of the APA that fought against kind of taking a formal stand on civil rights legislation. I mean, and above and beyond that, the APA has had a long, kind of very comfortable, overly comfortable, I think in many people's opinions, relationship to the US military, and a massive influx of kind of credibility and funding and stature for the field of psychology came about in the World War I and World War II eras, when psychologists kind of proved their usefulness by applying mental tests to the large body of GIs who were drafted for service in World War I. And they made arguments about, kind of how useful the field could be to government and society. And there's a kind of steady relationship of patronage and funding for military projects that, and research that, that informed kind of like military policies and goals and things like that, that I think Dr. Albert McCoy will talk about here in one of the later sessions. But, it's just to say that many of the APA presidents and office holders and things like that had relationships with the military, contracts for research, with the Department of Defense and other individuals. So, there's never been a kind of independence of that. And the field itself has kind of been divided between those who are clinicians and practitioners, and those who are research scientists who have the explicit goal of sometimes just kind of predicting and controlling behavior. So, anybody else wants to weigh? If anyone else wants to weigh in.
I would like to say a couple of things about that. I think as well as psychology that, but maybe particularly psychology, I don't know, is infected with a kind of technical morality, which I would describe, first of all, as a kind of almost hyper belief in the authority of science, and psychology sees itself as a science, which comes to be separated from a substantive kind of morality. That is, the authority of science becomes an end in itself. And morality gets sidelined, the moral questions about what we are doing. And there's another kind of morality that often goes with that, I think, not only in the professions, but in our modern bureaucratic society. There's a morality of ideas connected with productivity and efficiency, but it's ultimately a morality of doing one's job well. And if that becomes a central focus of who we are and how we see our lives and our professions, again, we somehow a substantive morality gets sidelined. And then you add into that another characteristic of bureaucracy, which is, bureaucracies are always very complex, and who's actually responsible for the decisions. There's a tendency to believe that responsibility lies elsewhere, right? That the people up there are certainly figuring out what's the right and wrong of this, the legality or the illegality, and so therefore one is freed from making those decisions oneself. To the extent that we believe in those authority systems and punt on responsibility, we wind up committing acts that we believe and know in our heart to be wrong, but somehow get lost in those professions.
Thank you very much. This is a really enlightening presentations. I think it's clear from the first speaker and other speakers that the real purpose of torture is not really to get information. It's to basically, I believe, it's to terrorize the opponents of the U.S. U.S. imperial project around the world or whatever, and if not to terrorize them and their other people who might work with them, and then if that doesn't work, then to break them to the point where they cannot be useful human beings in opposition to the U.S. So this campaign that was. This ideological campaign that was alluded to by the last speaker, I think is really basically ideological. It's to win the American people over to the idea that they should support torture, even though the real purpose of torture is not in any way to protect people, but instead to oppose the, the opponents of U.S. corporate wealth and power and so forth. But I also think that it's more consistent in the sense that we shouldn't be surprised at all that the Democrats are rolling over on this question, because they have basically, under Democrats and Republicans all the way back, there's been the policy of war, but also of torture to back that up, from many, many different examples. So I just wanted to see what the speakers had to say about that.
Well, I'm actually saying something, thank you for your comment, I'm actually saying something even further extending to what you said. It's not even that torture doesn't work, it doesn't. It's not even that it has unintended consequences which are devastating to individuals and communities, because it does. But thirdly, it's not in the US strategic interest, I would say, to torture. It's counterproductive to the US interest, which is why there's this kind of really huge disconnect between what we know about torture, know about its impact on the world theater, the stage, individuals, communities, world opinion, and this sense of doing the right thing for US strategic interests. It's backfiring horribly at a very deep and profound level. That will take not just one, not just two, and not just 3 generations to overcome, but the research that we've done suggests that it can take upwards of 4 generations to really begin the process of overcoming, a torture project. So I think that its damage to this country is far beyond than what we can even imagine today.
I just wanted a quick comment. One wonders about motivation of those who create the policies, who know what they're doing, and it's an interesting question about if, in fact, torture is not in the national security interest of the United States, if it's counter to those interests, then why do relatively smart people, we think, continue to torture? And I would suggest that perhaps there's more of a between a rock and a hard place. I mean, on the one side, there might be some inklings that, well, this is really not good for us as a country. On the other side, we're involved in occupations and counterinsurgency warfare, and so there are very immediate military and now, of course, the security agencies are acting like military, right? I mean, it's the CIA, it's involved so much in these wars, making decisions that are sort of, on-the-ground decisions that say, in this case, we've got to use this, including to terrorize the local population. I mean, that's always there, always implied with the use of torture. So, I mean, it's no accident on the one side that a lot of the generals were opposed to the torture regime. I mean, a lot of the opposition came right out of the military. So you know that there's a debate going on over these issues. But on the other hand, I don't think it's clear, even within those agents.
I think it
for
is,
them.
Well, I think it's something that my colleague here said. There's a big split between FBI techniques, which are rapport building, which do in fact work for developing and getting information, and the CIA techniques, which are touch and no-touch torture techniques, which do not work. And I mean, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that if you want to get useful information for national security, there are methods, non-torture, non-touch techniques that work quite well. So the information is actually there.